From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
The judge in the federal election subversion case against Donald Trump unseals a redacted 165-page motion by special counsel Jack Smith detailing Trump's alleged increasingly desperate efforts, that's a quote, to overturn his 2020 election loss.
This just a day after his running mate, Senator J.D. Vance, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz spar in the vice presidential debate in New York.
I think it's important to actually explain to the American people where I come down on the issues and what changed.
Those of you out there listening tonight, you're hearing a lot of stuff back and forth, and it's good. It's healthy. That's what this is supposed to happen.
We'll be joined by Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana and Democratic pollster Celinda Lake for more on the race this hour as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris visit the Hurricane Helene ravaged Southeast.
Thanks for being with us on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. We begin this evening with new details of special counsel Jack Smith's election interference case against Donald Trump from a court filing today that includes new allegations against the former president. The 165-page report unsealed by U.S. prosecutors argues that Donald Trump should not be protected by presidential immunity, saying, quote, when the defendant lost the 2020 presidential election, he resorted to crimes to try to stay in office, unquote.
The special counsel's report includes an 80-page summary of the evidence gathered by investigators and describes occasions in which Trump spread claims of interference leading up to the events of January 6th. Smith writes, quote, the defendant knew that he had only one last hope to prevent Biden's certification as president, the large and angry crowd standing in front of him. So for more than an hour, the defendant delivered a speech designed to inflame his supporters and motivate them to march to the Capitol. End of quote. Now, of course, the former president's efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election was also a topic of discussion at last night's vice presidential debate with an exchange between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance.
Donald Trump's inability to say, he is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
For more, joining us now on the phone is Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. Senator, thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg. You, of course, were one of only a handful of Republican senators willing to certify the victory of Joe Biden and one of the first to publicly say that Donald Trump lost in 2020. What do you say to voters who watched that debate last night who find J.D. Vance's inability to say the same disqualifying?
I think that voters, if you just look at voters right now, voters have clearly processed it. Whatever you and I think, they've clearly processed it, and roughly 50% think that the alternative is better. You can argue that, but that's reality. And you can look at the facts of why they're making that decision. There's been incredible inflation over the last 3 years that have left many Americans poorer than when they started. Now, again, we can argue if that's the valid reason, but if you look at the economy, if you look at the border, if you look at kind of even now where there might be a strike about to take place, which will, again, maybe reignite inflation, folks are saying, maybe I don't like everything about my candidate, but I like it better than the alternative. And I am one to respect the wishes of the American people.
Understood, Senator. With that said, after what you watched last night, of course, 2020, as we just mentioned, was one of many issues discussed. Did that debate actually move the needle in this campaign? Is this race just unique to the point where the vice presidential debate can tip the scale?
I don't know that. It could. I think J.D. won. When the New York Times is writing an article basically excusing Walz's poor performance, that tells you that J.D. Vance won. I kind of liked it because Vance talked about a couple things when he spoke about a bipartisan effort on paid family leave. I'm reading that effort from the Republican side. And when he talked at the outset about maybe putting a tariff or a fee of some sort on countries that are producing all the pollution that's blowing over into our country, well, that's also something I'm working on. And so, of course, I like to hear that. Whether or not the American people find it meaningful, we'll just have to wait to see. But I think both of them kind of represented their side, and most people think the JD won.
Well, of course, they did dive into some pretty substantive policy discussions at certain points. It did feel a bit unusual almost for the kind of debates we're used to seeing in the past few cycles, Senator. They also discussed an issue that I know is near and dear to your heart, and that is American energy. This is what Governor Walz had to say about energy production in the United States.
We are producing more natural gas and more oil at any time than we ever have. We're also producing more clean energy. So the solution for us is to continue to move forward, that climate change is real. We are seeing us becoming an energy superpower for the future, not just the current. And that's what absolutely makes sense.
That is factually accurate, Senator. We are pumping a record amount of oil and gas. So when Donald Trump is saying drill, baby, drill, what needs to happen to drill more than we already are if it's already at a record?
First, let's say that record production is despite many of the Biden-Harris regulations. The natural gas is coming from the Haynesville Shale in North Louisiana, the Eagle Ford, and West Texas, as well as a few other, Marcellus. Those are private lands. Those are not federal lands. The first thing that Joe Biden did when he took office was kill the Keystone Pipeline, which would have brought more oil supply from Canada, our closest ally, one of them, down to the United States for processing. By the way, creating jobs in the United States. Now, what you could do on the increase is to have more leasing in the Outer Continental Shelf. That's off the coast, the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. When you do that, you create a lot of jobs, a lot of oil, a lot of natural gas, and we do it in a more environmentally friendly way than any other country in the world when it comes to our shore. So they're being a little disingenuous, taking credit for the production which is happening on private lands. Yes, we have more renewable energy, but that renewable trend has been going on for some time. So I think they're trying to have it both ways. Telling their environmentalists they're going to try and inhibit production off the coast of Louisiana, on the other hand claiming credit for production which is happening on private lands.
Well, I know that you've been passionate about the issues of permitting and also the LNG export ban, Senator. That's something that Tim Walz talked about last night as well. And he made the point, as Kayleigh just referenced and you did as well, that we're actually at a point of extracting a record amount of natural gas. He said there's no ban on that. So tell our audience what would happen if, in fact, we did lift the ban under another administration on LNG exports.
So LNG exports, a couple of things. One, our allies in Europe need our natural gas, our liquefied natural gas. If we don't want them to buy it from Russia to weaken the Russian war effort, they need to buy it from somebody, and we become the world's major supplier. So that's number one. Number two, you create lots of really good paying jobs when you build these facilities. And number three, it may seem counterintuitive, when you actually create a market to export our spare natural gas, you provide stability to the low prices for natural gas that we've had for some time. Lastly, I'll say this. When we burn natural gas instead of coal, when another country, for example, Germany or China or Korea, burns our natural gas instead of coal, that's better for the world's environment. Natural gas is much more cleanly burning than coal, and so therefore we replace the emissions that would result from coal with, frankly, no emissions when it comes to sulfur and no emissions when it comes to nitrates. So it actually improves the world environment as we produce more natural gas. Now, the Biden administration has put a hold on permitting LNG export facilities. That creates uncertainty, the potential to kill the construction jobs, and the potential to bring in instability in the pricing of natural gas. And it certainly hurts our allies, and it doesn't allow the substitution of natural gas for coal. It's like four bad things in a row, and the Biden administration is promoting that.
I know I'd get an answer on that. Senator, thank you so much for coming back to talk to us here. here on Bloomberg. Meet us in the studio next time. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana as we get things started this day after the debate. And we want to add the voice now of Bloomberg Opinion's Nia-Malika Henderson, who is, of course, watching along with all of us. What are your thoughts broadly? We don't have to get too deep into the energy sector, which is the senator's area of expertise here. But I think there are a lot of questions, no problem, about not just who won, but whether it matters in this campaign.
You know, I think if you look at some of the focus groups in the polling from folks who watched it, it seems like it was a draw. You saw a new J.D. Vance in many ways. I think he was trying to humanize himself. He'd gotten such a bad rap in the polls. His favorability was really low going in, and so he wanted to be kinder, gentler Vance. I think repair some of the gender gap that Donald Trump is seeing. He's losing women by record numbers. And Walz, it wasn't necessarily clear what his strategy was. I think he was Tim Walz, and he was up against a Yale-trained lawyer. And in so many ways, I think that showed. I think some viewers may have seen J.D. Vance as a bit smarmy, for lack of a better word. I grew up very religious, and I watched a lot of televangelists growing up, and there was a kind of a televangelist affect to J.D. Vance at times. I don't think it's going to move the needle. I think some viewers may have seen it as kind of boring, in fact, and may have wanted to turn. There was a WNBA game on, for instance, and maybe they've turned to that. So, yeah, we haven't seen many debates move the needle at all, VP debates. We, of course, saw a huge debate with Biden, caused him to drop out, and then the debate performance from Kamala Harris. You know, I think one takeaway I was watching was like, Kamala Harris is clearly the superior debater to all of these men who have come before us in these last couple of debates. But, yeah, I think in the end it was probably a draw. Probably no minds were changed by this.
Well, and it is a question, I guess, of what moments of the debate, if any, will live on beyond it. Well, one we have seen recirculating already today is that clip that we played at the top of the show, Tim Walz asking J.D. Vance whether Donald Trump lost in 2020, and J.D., instead of answering, or Senator Vance, rather, said, Tim, I'm focused on the future. Given the news we got today with the unsealing of the filing from Jack Smith that details all of the allegations surrounding Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, is that going to age even worse than it already might have?
Oh, yeah. And listen, the Kamala Harris campaign already cut an ad with this, because at some point J.D. Vance said he wanted to move on to the future. But at some point he said that there was, in fact, a peaceful transfer of power. And we, of course, know that there wasn't a peaceful transfer of power. So they've spliced his words from the debate with images from January 6th. That, I think, from the debate was Walz's strongest moment. Again, it came at the very end. I don't know how many people stayed to watch it, that 90-minute debate. But again, it's been surfaced in the ads, and of course it has new resonance given what is coming out of this filing from Jack Smith.
All right, Bloomberg Opinion's Nia-Malika Henderson, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And coming up, we'll turn to the devastation in the southeast. Hurricane Helene leaving a path of destruction. President Biden and Vice President Harris touring that aftermath today. We'll have those details and more on Jack Smith's unsealed, redacted filing next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Late this afternoon, a U.S. district judge unsealed a 165-page document with special counsel Jack Smith's findings in the Trump 2020 election interference subversion case here in Washington. The filings include messages that then President Trump sent behind the scenes on January 6, 2021, and more details around his alleged behavior. For more on what's in this document, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Sara Forden, who helps spearhead our legal coverage here in Washington. So, Sara, obviously, this is important as it's information that is now publicly available to the American voter. So how consequential is this, knowing it's unclear when, if ever, this is going to trial?
So absolutely. There's no trial date set yet. There's not even a hearing been set by Judge Chutkan, who is overseeing the case. But what we're getting here are new details that give us a flavor of how Jack Smith would argue the case when it goes to trial, if and when it goes to trial. And some of the most interesting details in this filing have to do with Trump's interactions with former Vice President Mike Pence. And there were a lot of raised eyebrows and even a attacks by Trump's lawyers when Jack Smith, the special counsel, refiled this indictment and left all the interactions with Pence in there. Why? You know, the Supreme Court had ruled that anything that had to do with Trump's official line of duty was not allowable in this case. He's got immunity for that. So Jack Smith is arguing that actually these interactions with Pence were as two running mates on the same ticket, not as official, president and vice president, and therefore they are allowable if this case goes to trial.
A lot of people said the same thing when this hit today. Timing, shades of James Comey, less than 5 weeks out from an election. This is unsealed. How come?
Well, I mean, this is part of the case getting started again after the Supreme Court handed it back to the lower court. There's no, there's nothing official that's going to actually be decided here, and the judge is setting her schedule. The filing also talks a lot about how Trump's interactions with the state election officials. And in that case, Smith is arguing that the president has no official role in how the states certify their elections. So again, all of those conversations amounted to private activities.
Can we address the redactions as well? I noticed redactions in some parts that were the name eliminated, but in parentheses, a description of that person's title, like Vice President's Chief of Staff. Why is any of this redacted at all, Sara?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the redactions were minimal and, as you said, sort of questionable because it was clear who they were referring to.
You don't need a decoder ring to figure out who we're talking about here.
Although you certainly need a lot of time to work through it all if you choose to read the whole thing. 165 pages long, 80 pages of evidence. Yeah. It's pretty substantive.
We have, by the way, heard from the Trump campaign, the spokesperson for the campaign, calling this a witch hunt, which you would expect to see, and calling into question the activities of the special counsel, suggesting that he was jumping the gun with an official special counsel report. Will we hear back from Jack Smith on that?
Well, it's not likely at this point. It'll go back to the Trump team, and then the government will be able to have a rebuttal before the end of October. So there will be more filings before the election.
Amazing. We'll, of course, be talking to Sara Forden about it right here. Thank you, Sara, for being with us as the news breaks today in Washington. This afternoon, Vice President Kamala Harris stopping by Georgia on a visit to tour some of the damaged areas from Hurricane Helene. She and President Biden also on the road today. He was in the Carolinas, the trip including stops across multiple states. And as I just mentioned, Carolinas, Georgia, two important swing states. We're now joined by Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsin for more on the political optics here against the backdrop of a natural disaster. Saleha, these are very delicate moments, but can be opportunities for a campaign. They're going to continue travel like this tomorrow, having already seen Donald Trump in Georgia. How are they doing on the tour?
You're right. Delicate is the right word for this, Joe, because you don't want neither Kamala Harris or Donald Trump want to look opportunistic. But at the same time, a former president and the sitting vice president, both who are running for a term, they should be present in North Carolina. I mean, this is an important region as well, but also bringing a spotlight to the area could unlock funding for them on the state level, federal level, et cetera, and get people's attention on this. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of each candidate trying to go on the offense and kind of own that story.
Well, we've heard from each of them respectively. Harris announcing 100% federal cost share for Georgia's aid that's needed, while Biden will do the same for North Carolina. Of course, this is not the only thing we heard from Joe Biden about today when he was talking about a natural disaster. He also was warning of man-made disaster today in reference to the ongoing dockworker strike that, of course, began yesterday, telling reporters he'd like to see an agreement as soon as possible.
This natural disaster is incredibly consequential. The last thing we need on top of that is a man-made disaster, what's going on at the ports. We're getting pushback already, and we're hearing from the folks regionally that they're having trouble getting product they need because of the port strike.
So obviously this is a difficult line for this administration to walk, Saleha. You want to be pro-union. You want to be on the side of collective bargaining and organized labor. But also, if you're warning about man-made disaster, knowing this could bring severe economic consequences, how long before push comes to shove and the administration has to change its tune?
Well, Biden has so far said he's not going to intervene, but we could very well hear in a couple of days, in a week, that he's already intervened. He comes out to say, okay, I made a phone call. This is an interesting moment, though, because Bloomberg just published a story last week that I wrote about how a Harris presidency, a potential Harris presidency, may very likely be more pro-business than Biden was. Biden really vilified business executives, corporations. And this is a moment where, like you're saying, he's walking this very careful line between wanting to vilify, again, the companies that are involved in this and raising prices and how it's affecting union workers. But maybe if he'd had better ties to corporations, he had a back channel to intervene through.
As opposed to Taft-Hartley taking extreme action, which he says he will not do. Kamala Harris has found some nuanced areas of sunlight between herself and Joe Biden since she's been at the top of the ticket. How about walk the picket line while the president's working this out?
Oh, I mean, you're right. She has found these little areas to exploit and to kind of cast herself a little bit differently from the Biden-Harris administration to just the Harris-Walz campaign. I don't know. Let's see if she's able to pull that off. Let's see what happens over the next couple of days.
All right. Bloomberg, Saleha, Mohsin, thank you so much for joining us. Now, President Biden also today joined a call with other G7 leaders to discuss the allies' response to Iran's missile strike against Israel yesterday. He spoke with reporters earlier about those discussions.
Obviously, Iran has gone way is way off board. We'll be discussing with the Israelis what they're going to do, but all seven of us agree that they have a right to respond, but they should respond in proportion.
For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg's Courtney McBride. Courtney, do we have an understanding of what this administration thinks a proportionate response is, knowing Biden was also asked if he supported Israel hitting Iran's nuclear sites, and he said no?
Well, we don't have a clear understanding of what would be acceptable, but we know that the nuclear sites and potentially some oil and gas infrastructure could precipitate another Iranian response and trigger another cycle of escalating violence, which is exactly what the Biden administration is trying to head off.
So it sounds like that might be a bridge too far for the White House and maybe for Israel. Nuclear sites are one thing. Energy infrastructure is off the table then, Courtney?
Well, they haven't said that it's off the table, but I think the key really seems to be from the U.S. perspective, calibrating a response that they expect to come militarily from Israel, but making sure that it is the type of response that is itself the end of this round of hostilities and that doesn't precipitate a tit for tat, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Well, tit for tat is something we've been hearing a lot about, Courtney. We also know that the U.S. has been preemptively sending more assets and troops to the Middle East. They were involved, of course, defensively yesterday, as we've talked about. Do we have an understanding of whether more assets are going to be deployed, or if they are keeping positioning on the U.S. part steady for now until they figure out how much tat is titted back?
I mean, at this stage, the U.S. forces, as you said, played a role in the response to the Iranian attack in defending and intercepting some of those incoming missiles. But at this stage, it seems to be status quo, and really those U.S. assets are there as a deterrent against further Iranian action.
So, Courtney, what's the next move for the administration? We've seen 10 visits by Anthony Blinken. We know Amos Hochstein has been deeply involved, apparently not very successfully, in preventing this incursion into Lebanon. Is the CIA director still engaged, or are we just waiting, like everyone else, to see what happens next?
Well, I mean, the continuing message from U.S. officials is that all of those talks are ongoing. You referenced CIA Director Bill Burns' efforts to secure a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the remaining hostages held by Hamas. All of those efforts continue, but obviously they have become a bit more complicated, perhaps a bit more difficult with the events of the last week or so.
Certainly. All right, Bloomberg's Courtney McBride, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, we'll turn back to last night's vice presidential debate, the first and the only, and probably the last debate we will see this cycle. We'll have more on how voters viewed the 90-minute discussion between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz with Celinda Lake, president of Lake Research Partners. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There was a different tone last night. How many times did Governor Walz and Senator Vance refer to each other and say, I agree, or I understand that, or I have compassion for you? It's a different kind of discussion than we had with Trump and with Harris just a few weeks ago.
That was Frank Luntz, of course, pollster and CEO of FIL Inc. on the early edition of Balance of Power, talking with us earlier about the tone of last night's vice presidential debate. And joining us now is Celinda Lake, president of Lake Research Partners, Democratic pollster. Celinda, it's great to have you back. Is that the real takeaway from this vice presidential debate last night? Not who won the issues or who performed best, but the fact that we got through 90 minutes without poison and vitriol being part of the conversation?
And I think people really welcomed it. I think also there were big takeaways on middle class, abortion, and authenticity.
Okay, so on the abortion and authenticity questions, the question of the timing in which those conversations happened in the debate is a big one. Obviously, it started on the Middle East, given the news flow of yesterday, Celinda, the perhaps very viral moment of Tim Walz and J.D. Vance going back and forth over January 6th and the 2020 election results didn't happen until very late, and that authenticity argument was kind of a closing one for Tim Walz. Was all of that too late for it to make a difference, or does social media make up for that?
I think social media makes up for it, and I think your coverage makes up for it. The press's interpretation of the debate is really important to the voters. And I think most voters, they'll say they watched it, but they probably stayed on for about 10 minutes max. And then they went on to other things. And particularly because this debate wasn't a fist fight, it was kind of boring, which voters are kind of welcoming that it was boring. But I think that it's the press accounts afterwards and the social media that lifts it up that's really important.
Well, last night during the debate, I'll bring it back to New York here, one of the more heated moments when Walz and Vance discussed women's reproductive rights. I want you to listen to what they said. Celinda will have you respond. Take a listen.
Donald Trump put this all into motion. He brags about how great it was that he put the judges in and overturned Roe versus Wade. In Minnesota, we are ranked first in health care for a reason. We trust women.
I want us as a Republican Party to be pro-family in the fullest sense of the word. In the state of Ohio, we had a referendum in 2023, and the people of Ohio voted overwhelmingly, by the way, against my position. And I think that what I learned from that, Nora, is that we've got to do a better job at winning back people's trust.
Celinda, J.D. Vance got high marks from some on that question. He was criticized by progressives, as you might imagine. But what can the Harris campaign learn about the way he framed that issue over the course of the next 5 weeks?
Well, I think one thing that they can learn is, and they have learned, is that the Republicans, J.D. Vance is right. The Republicans are in trouble on this issue. And every week they try a new strategy to get out of that trouble. They tried the states' rights, and then people say, no, I want national guarantee. They tried that we're going to be the party of babies. And our party said, great, let's double the funding for maternal and child health care. Let's double the funding for prenatal care. Let's double the funding for Head Start. And, of course, we didn't get anybody to take us up on it. Now it's like we have a trust problem and we're going to fix it. Yes, you have a fundamental trust problem when you take away people's freedoms. And the real stories of women are going to counter all of this rhetoric. And actually, the abortion moment in the debate was the #1 moment that was ranked highest for Walz and was the biggest contrast, and to Walz's and the Democrats' benefit.
Interesting that it was abortion more so the moment on January 6th that already has been spun into an ad. It does raise the question, Celinda, if the Republican ticket wants to gain voters' trust on reproductive rights, maybe the Democratic ticket wants to gain more traction on the economy or help to ease the pressure of the border question. How is that going to be done from here when there are going to be no more organized forums like this, no more debates around the books between now and November 5th. So is this all advertising wars from here? How does it work?
It's advertising wars, social media wars. And the second best testing part of the debate for Walz was his commitment to the middle class and saying that both he and Harris rooted soundly in the middle class. And he looked like he's someone from the middle class and got out of his personal background and then came back to that authentic personal middle class experience at the end of the debate. Our number one goal has to be to get out our economic plan. And that's in advertising. That's in Democrats passing it on to their friends and family and neighbors. That's in social media, every vehicle available to us, because Harris is still not that well known and it's relatively new to the voters, particularly low information voters. So I take a great deal of confidence away from the fact that Walz's second best testing answer was on the middle class.
What's going to be the October surprise, Celinda? How does Kamala Harris, how do Democrats get ready for it?
You don't think that war in the Middle East and strikes on
Well, I don't know. We got 3 in one day yesterday. We got a dockworkers strike. We've got a natural disaster. Surely October has more in store.
I hope not. The voters hope not. I think the voters are just like, what's going to happen next? Who can imagine? The unimaginable keeps happening and happening. And I think in that context, people are not going to look for chaotic leadership. They're going to look for steady hands, stability, people who are going to bring people together. And Walz really demonstrated that last night and worked to get the solutions we need to the problems. Can we just simply agree on things and move forward?
Well, while a lot of voters might be over it already, just wanting this whole process to be over, there are at least some out there, Celinda, who have not yet made up their minds, who have not yet heard enough to do so. How small do you expect that basket is now? We were talking, maybe 5 to 7% of the electorate beforehand. Is that even narrower now in these final weeks?
Yes, it's about 9% who show up in the polls, but about half of those people probably in the end won't vote. So we're down to about 5% who are truly undecided. There are some soft support on each side, but, both campaigns are switching now to a turnout game and then trying to get those last 5%. And for the Democrats, it's women, it's non-college educated women, it's married women, and trying to keep them from voting the same way as their husbands.
What's the most important thing for Kamala Harris to show America here as she visits these states that were hit by Hurricane Helene? She's down south today, Celinda, in Georgia. She'll continue her tour of the Southeast, apparently after Joe Biden wraps up his day in the Carolinas. When you consider the optics of this moment, what does she need to show people who still haven't decided who to vote for?
I think that she needs to show compassion, which she easily does, but also effectiveness. People want to know that you're going to get something done in a crisis. And actually, interestingly, people think that could be a major role for a vice president. So this is she's proving herself in an arena where she's already pretty proven. FEMA is a very popular agency, and they're doing an incredible job, helped by a lot of other people, National Guard, et cetera. And this is interesting because it weaves into the story, right, of Tim Walz being in the National Guard for so many years. And then I think the other thing is that she's listening to people. She's not yelling at them. She's not throwing paper towels at them. And that whether you're a Democrat, Republican, whether you voted for her or not, she is going to get things done for you.
All right, Celinda Lake, president of Lake Research Partners, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, we'll have more on the fallout from the vice presidential debate as we turn to our political panel for their analysis on whether the candidates' performances tip the scale or not. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I know a lot of you are struggling. I know a lot of you are worried about paying the bills. It's going to stop when Donald Trump brings back common sense to this country.
Kamala Harris and I do believe in the middle class because that's where we come from.
When people say that Donald Trump's economic plan doesn't make sense, I say look at the record.
Kamala Harris has said to do the things she wants to do, we'll just ask the wealthiest to pay their fair share.
One thing that Joe Biden did is he continued some of the Trump tariffs that protected American manufacturing jobs.
I'm a union guy on this. I'm not a guy who wanted to ship things overseas.
If Kamala Harris has such great plans for how to address middle-class problems, then she ought to do them now.
We're just asking for fairness in it, and that's all you want.
Those were just some of the moments from last night's vice presidential debate. For more now here on Bloomberg TV and radio, we're joined by our political panel this evening. Matt Gorman, Vice President of Targeted Victory and Republican strategist, alongside Christy Setzer, President and founder of New Heights Communications and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. We now have had almost a full 24 hours to digest what we heard last night. It was a lot about policy, including economic policy, some foreign policy as well. That may also be the reason why some watching it may have found it boring. So the question is, was a needle moved? Christy, did Tim Walz help add to momentum for the Harris-Walz campaign or just not slow it down?
I would say not much moved after last night. I think that most people would say that they kind of fought each other to a draw. J.D. Vance was certainly the, as advertised, smooth Yale lawyer that we all heard about. He, made some decent points. He certainly came across well. I think that Tim Walz initially was nervous. He sputtered his answers a little bit. He definitely talked too fast. There were all these things. But at the end of the day, I believe that people found him to be more of a regular guy and someone who is relatable. And whereas J.D. Vance, they found a little smug and smarmy and a little too smooth. So does it ultimately do anything? I don't think it does. People are still looking at the top of the ticket.
Yet they really seemed to enjoy their time together. I thought they were going to hug when it was over, Matt. It was kind of a Thelma and Louise. All the families came up. I believe it was Frank Luntz who said earlier that last night we saw the two people who should be at the top of their respective tickets. What did we learn about the running mates in there today?
I mean, look, they each had something very specific they needed to do. And look, I'll say this as well. One of the hardest things to do is when you're expected to do well, still surpass that bar. And J.D. Vance did it. Him and his team, the folks I talked to, they were very acutely aware of their vulnerabilities and the challenges that faced him from the image, his little bit of a rocky rollout. And the word I kept hearing over and over again going into last night was disarm. He wanted to disarm the critiques. And I think what you saw is a very disarming demeanor. And you saw an introduction that maybe they wish they had when he was first announced as the vice presidential nominee. And look, that also speaks to the fact that doing interviews helps. Doing media helps. It refines your arguments. You hear the questions. I think having J.D. out there doing interviews with Margaret Brennan and others, and Walz being cloistered away, showed. It really did show.
But it was in some of those interviews that J.D. Vance was having some trouble. He was in an interview in which he said he made up the story about the cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio. If he has to make up stories to get the media to pay attention, then that's what he'll do. So I guess it becomes a question of if we're likely to see a return to that J.D. Vance, or if this J.D. Vance from the debate stage can carry forward for the next 5 weeks and exercise the same degree of discipline we saw from him last night. If Kamala Harris wanted to do all these things, she could have done it in the last 3.5 years.
He's been saying that, too. That's been a large message of his on the stump. But I think also the fact that he already had an answer ready to go. He's been asked about the cats and the dogs and the childless cat ladies, all those comments a dozen times already. Again, you contrast with Walz, who should have had a better answer for where was he in China during Tiananmen Square, and he didn't. It shows the value of being able to go through that gauntlet.
Did it bother you that he couldn't say that Joe Biden won the election?
No, because, again, he's been asked this numerous times. That was nothing new. I get
but
the
Democrats.
Democrats
Cut up and it's posted in isolation and people see it in a vacuum the day after.
I think if Democrats had a better night, they needed something to kind of latch onto, because Walz was pretty underwhelming performance. They needed something to latch onto and push to the media to try and go on offense. They found that gives them kind of a little bit of self-assurance, but that was nothing new, and I think they just have to latch on to something.
Well, to the point about having prepared answers and doing the interviews, we have learned from the campaign that Tim Walz is going to be out there. He's going to do a couple more network TV interviews. He's also going to sit down for what was described, I believe, as a pop culture podcast. I'm not sure which one that is. Does he need to have a better answer prepared, not just on where he was in the summer of 1989 and whether he was present for Tiananmen Square oriented protests, but also his military record? Because if you remember, the last time he was asked about that in an interview, he blamed it on grammar.
He does need a better interview, and frankly, it was surprising that he didn't have a tighter answer last night. I would attribute them to the fact that he was incredibly nervous. You could just see him going through sort of the Rolodex of answers that they had prepared for him, that he'd worked with the debate prep team on, and that covered who he actually is. The reason that he had such a wonderful rollout as vice presidential nominee was because he seemed to be this really natural, charming, lovable, folksy guy. And we just really didn't get a lot of that last night. Again, that said, he's still, if you looked at focus groups afterwards, he won over independents. In general, people thought that they kind of fought it to a draw. So I think he'll do better in settings like those, short interviews and more podcasts where he can be more of himself.
A lot of Republicans saying the same thing today as they were after the last debate. You can talk about a lot of different issues, style, character, Donald Trump's erratic, but no new wars, good economy. What's the Democratic response to that?
Well, which one do you want to do first? I would say that under Joe Biden, we've had the best economy in multiple generations. The stock market, obviously, at record high. You guys know all the stats. So there's certainly that.
Inflation's been a real problem, and he's
and it's coming down. And again, if you look at people and talk to them about the issue of inflation particularly, that is even another one where the Harris campaign has battled the Trump back to a draw on the issue of the economy and even on inflation. In terms of Donald Trump's and foreign policy, and one thing that you can say about both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is that they are people who take an even keel view of the world. That is not something that one can say about Donald Trump.
Very quickly on the subject of Donald Trump, we got a 165-page filing from Jack Smith unsealed in the 2020 election case here in Washington. This thing isn't going to go to trial before November, so motions like this one, filings like this one is all we're going to get. Do they matter at this point, or is the voting electorate moved on from this?
I think for 30 some odd days, this thing is in stasis. It will matter certainly if he wins or if he loses, and there'll be the repercussions one way or another come after election day, and that will be something they'll figure out. But right now, I think it is way too close to the election to have any tangible impact on the vote.
All right, coming up with our panel, tensions rising following Iran's missile strike on Israel yesterday. What escalation could mean globally? We'll have much more coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Proportionate and appropriate are really important questions here, not just for Israel, but for the United States, because let's be clear, we do not want to get drawn into a war in the Middle East. They can't just shoot 180 ballistic missiles at Israel, a close ally of ours, with impunity. So there has to be a response, but it has to be a response calibrated correctly to send a very strong, definitive message to Iran.
It was Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts talking with us on the early edition of Balance of Power, a member of the Armed Services Committee in the House. And back with us, our political panel, Matt Gorman and Christy Setzer, with us at the table tonight. Thanks to both of you for being here. Matt, no matter what happens here, the U.S. appears committed to defending Israel. If there is another response from Iran, assuming there's going to be a retaliation here, if that's the case, Joe Biden's fingerprints are going to be on this, as will be Kamala Harris's. What impact will it have on the race?
Look, I think one of the big unknown questions is normally the last debate, or effective last debate, is usually about October 20th, 25th.
Yeah.
That's about 10 days between the last debate and election day. We have a month, five weeks even. Mm-hmm. So there is a long window for events like this, the longshoreman strike, and other things to suddenly create a vacuum that could affect this race one way or another in ways we don't exactly fully know yet. Because right now, Trump isn't driving a message, these outside forces are. And I think that is a very big unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that may be the case. We don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East. Of course, Donald Trump is suggesting he sees the world on the brink of World War III, whether or not you believe that to be true. That does mean that Kamala Harris might find herself in the Situation Room a few more times between now and November, potentially. She clearly highlighted that yesterday, saying she was in the Situation Room, a power of incumbency here. But how does that work in her favor?
I'd say it does. I would think that if there was an opportunity for the Harris campaign to draw a contrast on, again, how they would see the world stage, Joe Biden is someone that, you know, the longtime chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he loved talking about his relationships with world leaders and how he was just, again, sort of a calming force on the global stage. That is in stark contrast to Donald Trump, who cozies up to dictators, whether it is Putin, whether it's Orban, whether it's El-Sisi. He sort of seems to love all of them and is weirdly bloodthirsty in a way, like talking about his day of violence. What that does to regular voters is it freaks them out. It absolutely freaks them out. So what Kamala Harris has to do is sort of toe the line of both showing that Donald Trump is this erratic figure that we cannot trust on the world stage again. He created violence at home. He will create violence abroad, et cetera. And also showing that she does know how to calm nerves. She has called for a ceasefire. She's doing all the right things. So that is what I would do if I were her campaign. I would just continue to starkly draw that contrast.
This is after we heard about J.D. Vance sanding off the sharp edges on Donald Trump's message last night. Is he the salve for the type of language, the incendiary remarks that Christie's talking about?
I mean, I thought his first answer was very effective, right? Because there wasn't this sort of chaos in the world. People feared what America could do, or people feared the strength of American foreign policy under a Trump presidency. There is that, doesn't need that fear. There's a lot of incursions, a lot of testing under Joe Biden, and obviously now under Kamala Harris as well. So I think that was the really important point, was that Trump and the Trump presidency provided the strength that would deter some of these folks from acting like this.
We have less than a minute left, but Christy, were you surprised that we didn't hear about Russia and Ukraine last night? Was that a disservice?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they kept saying we have a lot of things to get to, and they sure did. I was surprised by the conversation about public lands, for example. But yeah.
All right. Christy Setzer and Matt Gorman, our political panel this evening on this night after the night of the vice presidential debate. Thank you so much. Of course, you continue to get more coverage in the Washington Edition newsletter. You can always find that on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow. Of course, for those of you celebrating the high holidays, Happy New Year. And thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg Radio and TV.